Hey guys, tonight we're going to dim the lights way down low, maybe light a candle if that's your thing, and settle in for a story that stretches back further than you might think. We're going to journey through the long, often difficult, and sometimes surprising history of how people with Down syndrome were treated across different eras and cultures. It's a topic that touches on medicine, society, religion, and maybe a little bit of the fundamental human question of how we treat those who are different. And just a heads up, some parts of this history, well, let's just say surviving the whole 15,000 words might be a challenge, but I believe in you. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And as always, let me know in the comments where you're listening from tonight, and what time it is. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Imagine, if you will, the world before written history. The flickering firelight in a cave, the rustle of leaves just outside, the constant, gnawing uncertainty of survival. You're huddled with your small tribe, every member's contribution vital for finding food, staying warm, and avoiding becoming someone else's dinner. In this incredibly precarious existence, what happens when a child is born who is different? Someone who develops more slowly, perhaps has distinct physical features, or learns in ways that don't fit the immediate demands of hunting mammoths or identifying edible berries. This is where our story begins, shrouded in the deep, ancient shadows before anyone had a name for specific conditions like Down syndrome. We're talking about a time when the very concept of intellectual difference as a distinct category was utterly unknown. People understood physical differences, sure, someone was stronger, someone was faster, someone had a limp. But variations in cognitive ability? Those were likely perceived through the lens of immediate functionality and the prevailing belief systems, whatever they might have been. Was this person able to help the group? Were they seen as a burden? Or, perhaps, were they viewed through a spiritual lens, touched by the gods, or maybe, something less benign? Trying to piece together the treatment of individuals with developmental differences in prehistory is like trying to assemble a jigsaw puzzle when you only have 3 pieces and they're all covered in mud. We have no written records, no medical texts, obviously, and very little archaeological evidence that can be definitively linked to specific conditions. What we do have are skeletal remains, sometimes found in burial sites, and the interpretations we can make from them. Some ancient skeletons show signs of congenital conditions or unusual development. Finding these remains, particularly if they belong to individuals who survived past infancy in a harsh environment, can suggest that some level of care or acceptance existed within their group. After all, if you couldn't keep up, if you needed extra help, simple abandonment would have been the easiest, and perhaps sometimes necessary, path for a nomadic group constantly on the move. The fact that some individuals with clear physical or developmental challenges did survive into childhood, or even adulthood implies that someone was looking out for them. Someone was sharing food, offering protection, perhaps carrying them when the group moved. This isn't definitive proof of treatment as we understand it, but it suggests a basic level of human connection and care prevailed, at least in some cases. Conversely, there's the stark reality of survival of the fittest in its rawest form. Infanticide was a grim reality in many early societies, often practiced when resources were scarce or when a child was perceived as too weak or too different to survive and contribute. This wasn't necessarily born out of malice, but out of a desperate pragmatism driven by the need for the group's survival. A child requiring significant extra care could potentially jeopardize the entire group's ability to find food or escape danger. It's uncomfortable to think about, but essential to understanding the context. You wouldn't survive long if you were the slowest runner, and a saber-toothed cat was having a bad day. As early human societies began to settle and form villages and eventually civilizations, the dynamics shifted slightly. With more stable food sources and shelter, the immediate pressure of constant movement lessened. This might have created slightly more space for individuals who required more care. However, understanding remained primitive. Intellectual differences weren't seen as biological conditions, but likely attributed to spiritual causes, divine favor, or perhaps demonic influence. Someone who behaved unpredictably might be seen as possessed, or conversely, as a shaman or oracle, capable of communicating with the spirit world. This duality, fear and reverence, likely colored perceptions. Consider the earliest large-scale societies we have more information about, like ancient Egypt or Mesopotamia. Even here, specific records about individuals with intellectual disabilities are incredibly scarce. We have medical papyri from Egypt detailing treatments for all sorts of ailments, but nothing that clearly describes or attempts to explain conditions like Down syndrome. This lack of specific mention could mean a few things. Either individuals with these conditions had very low survival rates and weren't commonly encountered, or they were simply grouped under broader, less defined categories of difference or illness, or their existence wasn't considered significant enough to document in the medical or historical records that survive today. Historians still argue whether certain vague descriptions in ancient texts might refer to developmental differences, but there's no consensus. What we do know is that ancient societies had complex social structures and belief systems. In Egypt, for instance, people with physical differences, such as dwarfism, were sometimes revered and held positions of status, even seen as having connections to deities like Bes. This offers a tantalizing, though speculative, possibility that some forms of visible difference were not always met with rejection, but could occasionally be integrated into the social, or even religious fabric. Could this acceptance have extended to individuals with the physical characteristics often associated with Down syndrome? It's possible, but there's no direct evidence to confirm it. A quirky tidbit is the discovery of ancient skeletons showing evidence of trepanation, drilling holes in the skull, which was sometimes performed for medical or spiritual reasons, including potentially to release evil spirits thought to cause unusual behavior. While not specific to intellectual disability, it shows how ancient people tried to treat conditions they didn't understand, often through methods that seem bizarre or brutal to us now. Imagine trying to explain chromosomes to someone who thinks headaches are caused by tiny demons. Good luck with that. The prevailing view is that in these ancient times, survival for anyone with significant needs or differences was a constant struggle, heavily dependent on the compassion and resources of their immediate family or community. There were no social safety nets, no specialized care, no understanding of underlying biological causes. Life was tough for everyone, and exponentially tougher if you weren't able to contribute fully to the physical demands of existence. While we might hope for widespread ancient kindness, the reality is likely more nuanced, a mix of occasional protection driven by familial bonds or rare societal acceptance, alongside the grim realities of abandonment, neglect, or even practices aimed at purifying the community of perceived imperfections. The shadows of these ancient eras hold few clear answers, leaving us to infer possibilities from the scant clues available, a testament to how unseen these differences truly were to the people living them. Leaving the deep shadows of prehistory and the early civilizations behind, we drift forward in time, carried by the slow current of history towards the classical world. Imagine yourself walking the marble streets of ancient Athens, the air thick with the scent of olives and philosophy, or standing in the bustling forum of Rome, the sounds of commerce and politics swirling around you. These were societies that laid many foundations for the Western world, in law, governance, art, and thought. But how did they view and treat individuals who were intellectually different? Did the rise of complex philosophy and early medicine lead to greater understanding, or did ancient superstitions hold just as firm a grip? As with the eras before, fin. Specific, undeniable evidence about people with conditions like Down syndrome in classical Greece and Rome is incredibly challenging. The medical writings of Hippocrates, Galen, and others are extensive, detailing a vast array of illnesses, injuries, and conditions. They discussed epilepsy, mental illness, in ways they understood it, and physical deformities. Yet there is no clear description that matches the specific constellation of features and developmental trajectory associated with Down syndrome. This absence could mean a few things. Maybe survival rates into adulthood were still incredibly low, meaning individuals weren't commonly seen. Or perhaps they were simply categorized under broader terms for intellectual impairment, physical deformity, or even considered a form of madness or idiocy, without specific differentiation. What we do know is that classical societies, particularly the Greeks and Romans, placed a high value on physical and mental perfection, or at least, functionality and contribution to the polis or state. In many city-states in Greece, and later in Rome, there were accepted, albeit brutal, practices regarding the fate of newborns who were perceived as weak, deformed, or otherwise unfit. This wasn't necessarily about malice towards the child, but again, a harsh pragmatism rooted in the needs of the family and the state. A child deemed unable to grow into a contributing citizen could be exposed, left out to die, often in a public place, or sometimes drowned. This practice was, chillingly, sometimes seen as a parent's right or even duty, sanctioned by law or custom. The famous, or infamous, example often cited is the Spartan practice where newborns were inspected by elders, and those deemed weak or imperfect were allegedly taken to a chasm on Mount Taygetus and left to die. Historians still argue whether this was a widespread, literal practice for all perceived weak infants, or more of a symbolic act, or perhaps only applied in extreme cases, but the idea of societal sanction for eliminating unfit infants was certainly present in the classical mindset. Roman law, too, reflected this attitude. The 12 Tables, an early Roman legal code, reportedly gave fathers the right to kill a child who was monstrously deformed. While the definition of monstrously deformed isn't precisely clear and likely covered a wide range of conditions, it certainly didn't bode well for a child born with significant physical or intellectual differences. The survival of such a child would have depended almost entirely on the willingness and ability of the individual family to provide care, often against prevailing societal norms or even legal allowances for abandonment. Imagine trying to raise a child who needed constant care in a society where your neighbors might quietly suggest you're defying the gods or burdening the community. It wasn't exactly a supportive environment for difference. Superstition remained a powerful force, even in societies that prided themselves on reason and logic. Births of children with unusual features or behaviors could be interpreted as omens, signs from the gods, either good or bad. A child with unusual appearance might be seen as touched by a deity, perhaps destined for a unique role, or conversely, as a bad omen, a sign of divine displeasure requiring appeasement. The line between blessing and curse was often blurry and likely depended on the specific circumstances, the family's social standing, and the prevailing mood of the community. You might be revered one day and ostracized the next, depending on which way the mystical winds were blowing. Early forms of medical understanding, while advancing significantly beyond prehistory, still lacked the conceptual framework to understand chromosomal disorders. Illnesses and conditions were often attributed to imbalances of humors, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, black bile, or external factors like climate, diet, or divine intervention. Trying to explain a condition like Down syndrome within this framework would be like trying to explain Wi-Fi using only smoke signals, utterly impossible. So, medical texts offer no specific guidance on care, prognosis, or understanding. Treatment, if any, would have been based on general principles of care for the sick or disabled, often intertwined with religious rituals or folk remedies. Remember that crocodile dung sunscreen we mused about in ancient Egypt? Classical medicine wasn't quite that out there, but it had its own set of practices that seem bizarre to us now, like bloodletting or using strange poultices, none of which would have addressed the underlying condition. Despite the harsh realities and lack of understanding, it's crucial not to paint an entirely bleak picture. Familial bonds existed then just as they do now. There were undoubtedly families who, despite the difficulties and societal pressures, chose to protect and care for their children who were different. Evidence for this is indirect. The simple fact that some individuals with congenital conditions or physical disabilities did survive into adulthood in ancient societies suggests that care and protection, perhaps within the private sphere of the family, were sometimes offered. There are also scattered references in historical texts to individuals with various forms of disability living within communities, sometimes supported by family, or even through begging. While these accounts rarely provide specific details about the nature of the disability, they hint that not everyone deemed imperfect was immediately cast out. Some level of tolerance, perhaps born of pity, custom, or familial love, must have existed in some corners of the classical world. However, the dominant picture that emerges from the classical era, based on legal codes, philosophical discussions about the ideal citizen, and medical texts that lack relevant descriptions, is one where individuals with significant intellectual or physical differences faced immense challenges to survival. Their existence was likely precarious, heavily dependent on individual circumstances and familial capacity, and viewed through a lens of pragmatism, superstition, and a profound lack of biological understanding. They were often unseen in the grand narratives, their lives unfolding in the private realm of the home, or tragically cut short shortly after birth. The age of classical reason offered intellectual giants and architectural marvels, but it provided little light or understanding for those whose differences didn't fit the classical ideal. And so, the journey continues, moving into a new era where different forces would shape perceptions and treatment. Leaving the classical world, with its marble ideals and stark pragmatism, we trudge forward through the muddy roads and shadowed forests of the Middle Ages. This era, spanning roughly from the 5th to the 15th century, saw the rise of powerful new forces, most notably the widespread dominance of Christianity in Europe and Islam across the Middle East, North Africa, and parts of Asia. These religions brought with them complex doctrines that profoundly shaped views on life, death, suffering, and charity, inevitably influencing how people perceived and treated those who were different. For the first time in a widespread, codified way, religious texts and teachings placed a significant emphasis on compassion, charity, and the inherent value of all souls in the eyes of God or Allah. The Christian concept of agape, or unconditional love, and the Islamic pillar of zakat, mandatory charitable giving, fostered an environment where caring for the poor, the sick, and the vulnerable was seen not just as a good deed, but as a religious duty. Monasteries and convents became centers of learning, but also havens that offered alms, food, and sometimes rudimentary care to those in need, including individuals with physical or mental infirmities. You can almost picture a weary traveler with a disabled child knocking on a monastery gate, hoping for shelter and kindness based on shared faith. This emphasis on mercy offered a potential lifeline that might have been less reliably available in purely pragmatic ancient societies. However, this was also an age steeped in deep-seated fear and superstition. While religion preached charity, it also painted a vivid picture of spiritual warfare, a constant battle between divine forces and malevolent demons. Illness, misfortune, and difference were frequently interpreted through this lens. A child born with unusual features or who behaved in ways that were not understood might be seen not as someone needing care, but as a vessel for evil spirits, a punishment from God for parental sin, or even a creature not of this world. This duality created a volatile environment where an individual's fate could swing wildly based on whether their difference was interpreted as a sign of divine grace, perhaps seen as an innocent closer to God, or demonic influence. Imagine being born different, and your neighbor whispers you're cursed, while the local priest wonders if you're possessed. Talk about mixed messages. This fear wasn't purely theological. It was also woven into the rich tapestry of medieval folklore. One particularly persistent and chilling belief was that of the changeling. The idea was that fairies or other supernatural beings would steal a healthy human baby from its cradle and replace it with one of their own, a sickly, fussy, or strangely behaving child. These changelings were often described in ways that, in retrospect, bear some resemblance to characteristics associated with various developmental differences, including perhaps Down syndrome. The belief wasn't just a spooky story, it had real-world consequences. Families who suspected their child was a changeling might resort to cruel methods to try and force the fairy creature to reveal itself or leave, sometimes involving neglect, exposure to cold, or even physical abuse, all in the misguided belief that they were reclaiming their real child. It's a horrifying thought, that a parent's love could be twisted into cruelty by fear and superstition, egged on by village gossip. Trying to convince someone their strange baby wasn't swapped by gnomes must have been a tough sell in medieval times. Social structures also played a role. In the feudal system, most people lived on manors, tied to the land and their lord. Survival depended on contributing to the agricultural labor force. An individual unable to perform physical work was a significant burden on their family and the manor's productivity. While a compassionate lord or a supportive extended family might provide care, resources were scarce, and the pressure to contribute was immense. There was no concept of state support or disability benefits. Survival was a family affair, and if the family couldn't cope, options were grim. As towns grew, they offered a different dynamic. Anonymity increased, which might have allowed some individuals with disabilities to live more independently, perhaps through begging. But it also increased the risk of exploitation or falling into extreme poverty, outside the traditional safety net, however fragile, of the manor or village. Specific medical understanding remained minimal. Medieval physicians, like their classical predecessors, relied on humoral theory and lacked any concept of genetic or chromosomal conditions. Treatments for physical ailments were often brutal or ineffective, and intellectual differences were simply not understood in medical terms. They were matters for theologians, folk healers, or exorcists. Historians still argue whether the care provided in religious institutions was genuinely therapeutic or primarily focused on spiritual salvation and basic sustenance, offering little in the way of specialized or understanding care for those with cognitive differences. It was certainly not the kind of support system we envision today. So, the medieval period presents a complex picture. On one hand, the rise of major charitable religions offered a new moral framework that encouraged compassion and care for the vulnerable, potentially saving lives that might have been lost in earlier, harsher eras. On the other hand, rampant superstition, fear of the unknown, and a profound lack of understanding about the biological basis of difference meant that individuals with conditions like Down syndrome were highly vulnerable to neglect, abuse, or marginalization, often seen through the terrifying lens of demonic possession or supernatural interference. Their lives were likely precarious, swinging between the potential for religious charity and the very real danger posed by fear, ignorance, and the enduring belief in changelings and curses. Leaving the muddy roads and shadowed forests of the Middle Ages behind, we step into the vibrant, tumultuous world of the Renaissance. Imagine the explosion of art, the rediscovery of ancient texts, the bold voyages of exploration, the unsettling challenge to old certainties brought by figures like Copernicus and Luther. This was a time when the European mind began to stretch, looking back to the classical world for inspiration, while simultaneously forging radically new paths in science, philosophy, and art. But how did this shifting worldview, this burgeoning curiosity about the natural world and human potential, impact the perception and treatment of those with intellectual differences? Did the light of humanism shine on everyone, or did the shadows of old fears and practical realities still loom large? The Renaissance, meaning rebirth, marked a gradual but profound shift away from the strictly religious and feudal framework of the Middle Ages towards a greater emphasis on human potential, reason, and empirical observation. That's your mainstream historical fact right there. Scholars pored over rediscovered Greek and Roman texts, not just for theological insights, but for their understanding of the world, the human body, and society. This renewed interest in classical learning, known as humanism, celebrated the achievements of humanity and encouraged critical thinking. You might think this would naturally lead to a more enlightened view of difference, perhaps even an early scientific curiosity about why some people develop differently. And in some very limited ways, it did plant tiny seeds. However, the old ways didn't vanish overnight. Superstition, folklore, and religious interpretations of misfortune remained deeply ingrained in society. While the educated elite debated philosophy and painted masterpieces, the vast majority of people still lived lives governed by agricultural cycles, local customs, and a healthy dose of fear about the unknown. The belief in changelings, for instance, didn't simply evaporate with the dawn of the Renaissance. It persisted in rural areas and among less educated populations for centuries, continuing to put vulnerable children at risk. Imagine trying to explain genetics to someone who's convinced a fairy swapped their baby. You'd probably get burned at the stake for witchcraft just for trying. One fascinating, albeit uncomfortable, aspect of the Renaissance is the visible presence of individuals with intellectual differences in a very specific social role, the court jester or fool. Now, jesters came in many forms: witty comedians, clever satirists, even acrobats. But there was a recognized category often called the natural fool. These were individuals with apparent intellectual disabilities whose behaviors were seen as inherently amusing or unpredictable, often because they lacked the social filters or conventional understanding of the world that others possessed. Unlike the clever, trained jester who pretended to be foolish, the natural fool was perceived as genuinely lacking in conventional sense. This is your quirky tidbit. Why were they kept in courts? Several reasons. They provided entertainment, their uninhibited behavior a stark contrast to the rigid etiquette of court life. Their pronouncements, sometimes nonsensical, sometimes surprisingly insightful, perhaps by accident, could be interpreted in multiple ways, offering a safe outlet for uncomfortable truths or simply adding to the court's eccentric charm. Kings and nobles would collect them, sometimes treating them as pets or curiosities, sometimes with genuine, if paternalistic, affection. For the individual, court life offered a degree of protection and sustenance they likely wouldn't have found elsewhere. They were clothed, fed, and sheltered within the walls of power. However, their existence was entirely dependent on the whim of their patron. They were objects of amusement, their humanity often secondary to their perceived foolishness. It was a strange fate, elevated from potential neglect or abandonment to living among royalty, but at the cost of their dignity and autonomy, constantly performing their difference for an audience. It wasn't exactly a life of self-determination, more like a gilded cage where your job was just being yourself, but in a way that made rich people laugh. Beyond the court, the Renaissance saw the very beginnings of institutions designed to care for the poor, the sick, and the mentally ill, often grouped together without much distinction. Hospitals, almshouses, and early asylums started to appear or grow, often founded by religious orders or wealthy patrons as acts of charity. These weren't specialized centers for intellectual disability. They were catch-all places for society's marginalized. Conditions varied widely, from relatively humane care in some well-funded religious houses to neglect and warehousing in overcrowded, poorly managed municipal institutions. Individuals with intellectual differences might find refuge in these places, alongside the mentally ill, the physically disabled, the elderly poor, and orphans. Care was usually basic: food, shelter, perhaps some rudimentary medical attention for physical ailments. There was still no understanding of the underlying causes of intellectual differences, and certainly no concept of education or therapy aimed at development. The focus was primarily on containment and basic welfare, driven by a mix of Christian charity and a desire to remove inconvenient or disruptive people from public view. The humanist ideal, while celebrating human potential, largely focused on the potential of the conventionally able human mind. While there was new curiosity about anatomy and the physical body, the brain and its functions remained largely a mystery. Intellectual differences were still often explained in terms of imbalances of humors, a persistent classical idea, or moral/spiritual failings, rather than biological variation. Historians still argue whether the charitable impulse of the Renaissance genuinely improved the daily lives of individuals with significant intellectual disabilities outside of specific, rare cases like court fools, or if they remained largely invisible, surviving precariously within families or hidden away in rudimentary institutions with little real understanding or support. The era's focus on reason and beauty didn't automatically translate into compassion or scientific inquiry for those who didn't fit the emerging ideals of human perfection. So, the Renaissance offered a mixed bag. The decline of overt changeling fears was slow, but the new emphasis on humanism and charity did create some limited pathways for survival and visibility, particularly in the strange, exploitative world of the court fool. Early institutional care offered a basic safety net for some, albeit one that lumped them in with many other vulnerable populations and provided little specialized support. The intellectual ferment of the age was beginning to lay groundwork for future scientific understanding, but it hadn't yet illuminated the mystery of intellectual disability itself. Individuals with conditions like Down syndrome likely remained largely misunderstood, their fates determined by a complex interplay of family capacity, local charity, lingering superstition, and the peculiar, sometimes cruel, whims of the powerful. Leaving the vibrant but often contradictory world of the Renaissance behind, we find ourselves moving into the 18th century, an age often called the Enlightenment. Imagine powdered wigs, ornate drawing rooms, the scent of ink and reasoned debate hanging in the air. This was a time when intellectual giants across Europe championed reason, logic, and the systematic study of the natural world. The focus shifted dramatically towards understanding the universe not through divine revelation or ancient texts alone, but through observation, experimentation, and classification. This was the dawn of modern science as we begin to recognize it, and it turned its sharp, analytical gaze not just on stars and atoms, but increasingly on humanity itself. The Enlightenment's core principle was that human reason could be used to understand and improve society and the human condition. This is your mainstream historical fact. Think of figures like Isaac Newton uncovering the laws of physics, or philosophers like John Locke and Jean-Jacques Rousseau pondering human nature and rights. This drive to understand and categorize everything extended naturally to human beings. Naturalists like Carl Linnaeus, famous for developing the system we still use to classify plants and animals, Homo sapiens, anyone, began applying similar principles to human variation. Suddenly, people weren't just people. They were subjects for scientific inquiry, to be measured, described, and categorized according to perceived differences. This new scientific approach, however, didn't automatically translate into greater understanding or compassion for those with intellectual differences. While the methods were new, observation, measurement, classification, the framework for understanding the mind was still incredibly primitive. The brain remained largely a black box. Intellectual differences were still often seen through a lens of deficiency, deviation from the norm, or even moral failing, but now with a veneer of scientific justification. Instead of demons or humors, people started talking about disordered nerves, brain lesions, without actually knowing what they were, or inherent, fixed capacities determined by, well, they weren't quite sure what, but they felt compelled to measure and categorize it anyway. Attempts were made to create taxonomies of human types, often based on physical characteristics, geographical origin, and perceived mental capacity. These early classifications were frequently hierarchical and deeply flawed, laying groundwork for later ideas about race and intelligence that would have devastating consequences. Within these broad classifications, individuals with significant intellectual differences were often grouped together under vague terms like idiocy or feeble-mindedness, seen as the lowest rung on the ladder of human intellect. There was little to no attempt to differentiate between various causes or types of intellectual disability. If you didn't fit the standard definition of reasoning human, you were simply placed in a category of deficit. One quirky, and rather disturbing, fringe tidbit from this era is the emergence of ideas that foreshadowed later phrenology. While phrenology proper became popular in the 19th century, the Enlightenment's drive to link physical form to mental capacity led some to speculate about the shape of the skull or face as indicators of intelligence or character. Think of physiognomy, the practice of assessing character or personality from outer appearance, especially the face. While not a rigorous science even by the standards of the day, it gained some traction, leading to bizarre interpretations of facial features and head shapes as signs of inherent traits, including intellectual ability or lack thereof. Imagine being judged as feeble-minded just because your head was a certain shape, a far cry from understanding chromosomes. For individuals with conditions like Down syndrome, who often have distinct physical features, this new emphasis on physical classification could have been a double-edged sword. On one hand, it might have led to them being noted and grouped together based on observable traits, perhaps paving the way for later medical description. On the other hand, these observable differences were immediately linked to perceived intellectual deficits within these hierarchical, often prejudiced, classification systems. They were categorized, yes, but as specimens of lower human types, reinforcing their marginalization rather than fostering understanding or support. Treatment and care remained largely unchanged from the medieval and Renaissance periods, though the justification for certain practices began to shift. Individuals with intellectual differences were still primarily cared for by families, often hidden away due to shame or difficulty managing their needs. For those without family support, or whose behavior was deemed disruptive, the options were limited to almshouses or the nascent asylums emerging for the mentally ill. These institutions were rarely equipped to provide anything beyond basic custodial care, food, shelter, and containment. The Enlightenment's focus on reason didn't extend to a practical understanding of how to educate or support someone whose reason developed differently. The scientific approach often meant observation and classification for the benefit of the observer, not intervention or therapy for the benefit of the observed. There was a growing interest in documenting human diversity, but this was often done through the lens of comparison to a norm, with any deviation seen as a deficiency. Medical texts from the 18th century might include descriptions of various physical anomalies or forms of idiocy, but they lacked a unifying theory or understanding of underlying causes. The term, congenital idiocy, might be used, acknowledging the condition was present from birth, but without any insight into why. Historians still argue whether these early attempts at classification, despite their flaws and prejudices, represented a genuine step towards scientific understanding of human variation, or if they primarily served to reinforce existing social biases and hierarchies under a new guise of scientific authority. Was it a clumsy first step towards modern genetics, or just a more sophisticated way of saying, different and therefore lesser? The Enlightenment, for all its brilliance and emphasis on reason, didn't yet provide the tools or the framework to truly understand conditions like Down syndrome. It provided new ways to observe and categorize, often leading to individuals being labeled and grouped based on perceived deficits and physical traits. The focus was on the what, documenting variation, rather than the why or the how to help. Treatment remained custodial, driven by social convenience and basic charity rather than therapeutic goals. The Age of Reason shone a light on many aspects of the world, but the specific nature of intellectual differences remained largely in the shadows, awaiting a different kind of scientific discovery. Leaving the abstract classifications and often cold gaze of the Enlightenment behind, we step into the 19th century. Imagine a world rapidly changing, steam engines chugging, factories rising, cities swelling, and science accelerating at an unprecedented pace. It was an era of grand discoveries, not just in physics and chemistry, but increasingly, in biology and medicine. Microscopes were getting better, scientists were beginning to understand cells, and the human body was being studied with a new level of detail. It was in this environment that, for the first time, a specific type of intellectual difference would be formally described and given a name, thanks to the observations of a curious physician. Our story now focuses on Dr. John Langdon Down. He was an English physician working at the Earlswood Asylum in Surrey, a large institution for people with intellectual disabilities. It was founded in 1847, part of that slow, hesitant movement towards institutional care we touched on earlier, though Earlswood was initially seen as quite progressive, aiming for education and training rather than just warehousing. This is your mainstream historical fact. The 19th century saw the growth of specialized institutions for individuals with intellectual disabilities, moving away, at least in theory, from lumping them in with the mentally ill or the poor. Down was a keen observer, a product of that Enlightenment legacy of classification, but with a deeper medical interest. As he worked with the many residents at Earlswood, he began to notice patterns. Among the diverse population of individuals classified broadly as having idiocy, or feeble-mindedness, he observed a particular group who shared a striking collection of physical features and developmental characteristics. He noted their facial appearance, often a flattened facial profile, upward slanting eyes, a smaller head, and a distinctive tongue and mouth shape. He also noted common health issues and a specific pattern of cognitive development, typically with significant intellectual disability. In 1866, Dr. Down published a paper titled, Observations on an Ethnic Classification of Idiots. Now, the title immediately flags a major problem with his initial description, viewed through our modern lens. Influenced by the prevailing, deeply flawed racial theories of his time, remember those Enlightenment-era attempts to classify humanity? Down used physical characteristics to group people with intellectual disabilities into categories he linked to different racial groups. He referred to the group with the features we now recognize as Down syndrome as Mongolian type of idiocy, believing their physical appearance resembled people from Mongolia. This is your quirky or fringe tidbit, though a deeply uncomfortable one. The very name initially given to the condition was rooted in racist and pseudoscientific ideas about human variation, a stark reminder that even scientific progress is often tainted by the prejudices of its era. Imagine classifying someone based on their perceived resemblance to a completely unrelated ethnic group, purely based on a few physical traits. Yikes! Despite the problematic and now rejected Mongolian terminology, which would thankfully be abandoned later, leading to the name Down syndrome. In his honor, Down's paper was groundbreaking because it was the first time anyone had described this specific collection of features and developmental patterns as a distinct clinical entity. Before Down, these individuals were just part of the undifferentiated mass of people with intellectual disabilities. Down's work, however flawed in its initial classification, drew a line around a specific group, marking the beginning of medical recognition for this particular condition. It was a crucial step, moving from vague categories of idiocy to identifying a syndrome, a collection of symptoms and characteristics that occur together. Down himself, despite his flawed classification system, was actually seen as a relatively compassionate physician for his time. He advocated for better care and education within the asylum system and believed that individuals with intellectual disabilities were capable of learning and development, a more optimistic view than many of his contemporaries who saw idiocy as a fixed and hopeless state. He recognized the variation within the group he described and argued against the idea that they were merely defective. He tried to understand why these differences occurred, though he lacked the tools to uncover the genetic cause. He speculated on various factors, including parental health and environmental influences, but genetics as we know it was still decades away from being understood. Down's work brought a specific type of intellectual disability into the medical spotlight. It meant that physicians could now begin to recognize and diagnose the condition, even if they didn't understand its cause. This recognition, however, didn't immediately translate into widespread improvements in treatment or societal acceptance. For most of the 19th century, individuals diagnosed with Mongolian idiocy were still often placed in large institutions like Ellswood. While some institutions, like Down's, aimed for education and training, many others were simply custodial, providing only basic care and removing individuals from their families and communities. Life in these institutions varied greatly. Some were relatively clean and orderly, offering structured routines and perhaps some basic schooling or occupational training. Others were overcrowded, understaffed, and neglectful, with residents receiving little stimulation or individual attention. The prevailing attitude, even among those who recognized the condition, was often one of pity mixed with a belief in the inherent limitations of the individuals. Education or meaningful inclusion in society wasn't widely considered feasible or desirable. The discovery and naming of the condition by Dr. Down in the 19th century was a pivotal moment, shifting it from an unseen difference to a recognized medical category. However, this recognition occurred within a societal context that was grappling with rapid industrialization, urbanization, and new, often harsh, social theories. The scientific gaze of the era, while capable of detailed observation, was also colored by prejudice and a profound lack of understanding about the true biological origins of difference. Historians still argue whether Down's classification, despite its racist underpinnings, ultimately benefited individuals by leading to specific recognition and study, or if the negative and stigmatizing label he applied did more harm by reinforcing prejudiced views and setting a trajectory for institutionalization based on perceived racial inferiority. The 19th century, therefore, marks a complex turning point. The condition we now call Down syndrome was identified and named, moving it from the shadows of undifferentiated idiocy into the realm of medical discourse. But this identification happened within a framework of flawed science and societal prejudice, leading to a name and classification that were deeply offensive and inaccurate. It set the stage for the next, often darker, chapters in the history of how society treated individuals with this newly defined difference, particularly as the century closed and new, terrifying ideas about heredity and fitness began to take hold. So, Dr. Down had given a specific name and description to a group of people previously lumped together in the general category of idiocy. This happened in the late 19th century, a time when science and medicine were making huge strides, but also when some truly terrible ideas were gaining traction, particularly concerning human heredity and social progress. As the 19th century bled into the 20th, the recognition of distinct conditions like Mongolian idiocy collided head-on with a terrifying new movement, eugenics. Imagine a group of well-meaning, often highly educated people, utterly convinced that they could improve the human race by controlling who reproduced. That's the core, chilling idea behind eugenics. Coined by Francis Galton, a cousin of Charles Darwin, in 1883, the term comes from the Greek word meaning good in birth, or well-born. The eugenics movement proposed using selective breeding, just like farmers did with livestock or gardeners with plants, to enhance desirable traits in the human population and reduce undesirable ones. This is your mainstream historical fact. Eugenics was a widespread social and scientific movement in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, advocating for the improvement of the human species through controlled breeding. It was embraced by academics, politicians, and even some social reformers across Europe and North America. Now, who decided what traits were desirable and undesirable? That's where things got truly dark and intertwined with existing prejudices. Desirable often meant intelligence, as defined by flawed tests, physical health, industriousness, and traits associated with dominant social groups. Undesirable included poverty, criminality, mental illness, physical disabilities, and crucially for our story, intellectual disabilities, including the condition Dr. Down had just described. People with perceived intellectual deficits were labeled feeble-minded, a broad term encompassing various levels of cognitive difference, and were seen as a drain on society and, worse, a threat to the genetic purity of the population. The thinking was, if these people were allowed to reproduce, they would pass on their defective genes, weakening the overall strength and intelligence of the nation. It sounds absolutely bonkers to us now, this pseudoscientific attempt to play God with human genetics based on flimsy evidence and massive prejudice. But it gained frightening momentum. It was like trying to build a perfect car by just throwing away any part that looked a bit funny, without understanding how the engine actually worked. The logical, in their twisted view, conclusion of this belief was to prevent undesirables from having children. This led to horrific policies, most notably forced sterilization. Across the United States and in several European countries, laws were passed authorizing the involuntary sterilization of individuals deemed unfit to reproduce, often without their consent or even knowledge. This included people in mental hospitals, prisons, and institutions for the feeble-minded. For individuals with Down syndrome living in institutions or even at home, they were prime targets for these procedures. The stated goal was to prevent the birth of future generations who would be a burden on the state or dilute the national gene pool. The reality was a massive violation of fundamental human rights and bodily autonomy, disproportionately targeting the poor, minorities, and those with disabilities. Imagine being told you couldn't have children, not because of your own choice, but because a government official or a doctor decided your genes weren't good enough. Beyond sterilization, the eugenics movement influenced many other aspects of life for people with intellectual disabilities. Immigration laws in some countries were designed to prevent people deemed feeble-minded from entering. Segregation was encouraged, keeping people with disabilities separate from the rest of society and institutions. Educational opportunities were limited, based on the eugenic belief that their capacities were fixed and limited by their heredity. Some of the more extreme eugenicists even advocated for euthanasia, though this was less widely implemented before the Nazi regime took these ideas to their most horrifying conclusion. A particularly creepy, almost surreal, fringe tidbit from the height of the eugenics movement in the U.S. were the fitter family contests held at state fairs in the 1920s and 30s. Instead of judging livestock, families would submit themselves to eugenic evaluations by experts, receiving grades based on their physical health, intelligence, often measured by dubious tests, and perceived genetic background. Families with good genes would win medals, just like prize-winning pigs or pumpkins. It was a grotesque public display of eugenic principles, reducing human worth to a genetic score and promoting the idea that having children was a civic duty only for the fit. It's hard to picture now, a blue ribbon for having the right genetic makeup. The influence of eugenics on the treatment of people with Down syndrome and other intellectual disabilities during this era was devastating. It provided a scientific justification for marginalization, institutionalization, and the denial of basic rights, including the right to marry and have a family. The very name, Mongolian idiocy, given by Dr. Down, unfortunately fit neatly into the eugenic framework of racial classification and hierarchy, making individuals with the condition particularly vulnerable to being seen as genetically inferior and a target for prevention. Historians still argue whether the widespread acceptance of eugenics was primarily driven by genuine, albeit misguided, scientific belief in improving public health, or if it was fundamentally a tool to reinforce existing social hierarchies and prejudices against immigrants, the poor, and minority groups, simply cloaked in scientific language. Regardless of the precise mix of motivations, the outcome was clear. The eugenics movement created a climate of fear and persecution for individuals with perceived genetic defects. It stripped them of their autonomy, subjected them to involuntary procedures, and cemented the idea that they were a problem to be managed or eliminated, rather than individuals with inherent worth. The discovery of the condition by Dr. Down, a step towards medical recognition, had tragically occurred just before the eugenics wave peaked, leaving individuals with this newly defined difference exposed to its full, horrifying force. The era of eugenics was a dark stain on the history of science and social policy, setting the stage for decades where individuals with intellectual disabilities would be hidden away, often suffering profoundly, out of public sight and conscience. So, the eugenics movement provided the chilling intellectual backdrop, a pseudoscientific justification for preventing people deemed unfit from reproducing and participating in society. But where did these individuals go? The answer, for hundreds of thousands across the Western world during the first half of the 20th century, was into large, often isolated, state-run institutions. This era is defined by the rise of these massive facilities, places where people with intellectual disabilities, including those with Down syndrome, still often referred to by the offensive, Mongolian idiocy, label, were hidden away from public view. This is your mainstream historical fact. The early to mid-20th century saw a dramatic increase in large, often state-funded, institutions specifically designated for individuals with intellectual disabilities, becoming the dominant model of care. These institutions were often presented to the public, and sometimes even initially conceived by their founders, as places of care, training, and protection. They were called training schools, state hospitals, or colonies. The idea was that individuals with intellectual disabilities needed a specialized environment, away from the complexities and dangers of mainstream society, where they could receive appropriate care and perhaps some level of education or vocational training. This sounded reasonable on paper, didn't it? A safe place, tailored care, sounds almost nice. The reality, however, was often starkly different. While some institutions were marginally better than others, the scale of these facilities, combined with chronic underfunding, understaffing, and a prevailing attitude that these individuals had limited potential, led to conditions that were far from ideal. Imagine living in a place that housed hundreds, sometimes thousands, of residents, often in dormitories with rows and rows of beds. Personal space was minimal, privacy was non-existent, and individual attention from staff was incredibly limited. It was less like a school or hospital and more like a human warehouse. Trying to feel like an individual when you're just one face in a crowd of thousands must have been profoundly isolating. Life in these institutions was typically highly regimented. Residents often wore uniforms, followed strict schedules for eating, sleeping, and activities, and had little to no say in their daily lives. The promised training, or education, was often rudimentary at best, focused primarily on basic self-care tasks or simple, repetitive chores needed to help run the institution itself, like laundry or kitchen work. The prevailing belief, heavily influenced by eugenics, was that their intellectual capacity was fixed and low, so investing in meaningful education or therapeutic support seemed pointless to many administrators and staff. Why bother teaching calculus when you're convinced someone can barely count to 10? Conditions could range from neglectful to outright abusive. Overcrowding led to poor sanitation and the rapid spread of infectious diseases. Understaffing meant residents might go hours without attention, sometimes left in restraints or isolated rooms if their behavior was deemed challenging. Physical, emotional, and even sexual abuse by staff or other residents was tragically common in many institutions, often going unreported and unpunished due to the closed-off nature of these facilities and the voicelessness of their residents. These places were literally hidden away, often built on the outskirts of towns or in rural areas, making it easy for the public to forget about the people inside. A particularly chilling, almost dystopian, quirky tidbit about some of the largest institutions was their sheer, self-contained scale. Places like Willowbrook State School in New York or Penn State School in Pennsylvania grew so large they were essentially small towns unto themselves, with their own power plants, farms, laundries, and security forces. This wasn't just practical, it reinforced their isolation from the outside world. Residents might spend their entire lives within the grounds of the institution, with minimal contact with family or the broader community. It was a world apart, governed by its own rules and rhythms, largely invisible to the taxpayers who funded it. Imagine living your whole life without ever seeing a grocery store, a park, or just walking down a regular street. Medical care within these institutions was often basic and reactive rather than preventative or specialized. While individuals with Down syndrome have specific health vulnerabilities, like heart defects or respiratory issues, these were frequently overlooked or inadequately treated in the general, often poor, medical facilities within institutions. Life expectancy remained significantly lower than for the general population, not just because of the underlying conditions, but because of the substandard care and harsh living conditions. The argument for institutionalization was often framed in terms of protecting society from individuals deemed dangerous or burdensome, and protecting the individuals themselves from a world they couldn't navigate. But historians still argue whether the primary motivation behind the widespread shift to large-scale institutionalization was genuine, if misguided, concern for care and protection, or if it was fundamentally a tool of social control and segregation, fueled by eugenic fears and a desire to remove inconvenient populations from public sight and conscience. Was it about helping them, or just getting them out of the way? Regardless of the exact balance of motivations, the impact on the lives of people with Down syndrome and other intellectual disabilities was profound and overwhelmingly negative. They were stripped of their identity, their potential was ignored, their rights were violated, and they were subjected to lives of monotony, neglect, and sometimes abuse, hidden behind the walls of institutions that became symbols of societal failure rather than care. This era wasn't about treatment aimed at helping individuals thrive. It was about management and containment. But even in these dark, hidden places, seeds of change were beginning to stir, often planted by the very people who had been told their children were hopeless cases. So, we've journeyed through ancient shadows, classical pragmatism, medieval fears, Renaissance curiosity, Enlightenment classifications, Dr. Down's discovery, the horrors of eugenics, and the isolating walls of institutions. We left off with the grim reality of life hidden away in those large, often neglectful facilities in the early to mid-20th century. It felt like a dead end, didn't it? Like the story of individuals with intellectual disabilities was destined to remain one of segregation, misunderstanding, and limited potential. But history, thankfully, rarely follows a straight line, and sometimes the most powerful force for change comes from the most unexpected places. Not from scientists or politicians or even physicians, but from ordinary people, parents who simply refuse to accept the prevailing narrative about their children. Imagine being told, in the mid-20th century, that your newborn child had Mongolian idiocy, that awful, lingering term, and that the best, perhaps only, option was to place them in an institution. You might be told it was for the child's own good, that they wouldn't learn or develop much, and that it would be too much of a burden on your family. This was the standard advice given to many parents of children with Down syndrome during this era. The medical and social establishment offered little hope and even less practical support for raising such a child at home or integrating them into the community. For decades, this advice was often followed, leading to the massive institutional populations we discussed. But for some parents, the love for their child was stronger than the fear, the shame, or the grim professional prognosis. They looked at their child, saw potential and personality, and simply couldn't reconcile the beautiful baby in their arms with the bleak future painted by the experts. They kept their children at home, often against considerable societal pressure and without adequate resources or support. They taught them, played with them, and loved them, proving that these children could learn and thrive in a family environment. This is your mainstream historical fact. Starting in the mid-20th century, a growing number of parents of children with intellectual disabilities, including Down syndrome, began actively rejecting institutionalization and advocating for their children's right to live at home and receive community-based support and education. These parents faced immense challenges. There were no specialized schools, no therapists who understood developmental disabilities in this context, no government support programs. Daily life was a constant struggle to find information, access basic services, and simply cope with the demands of caregiving without a support system. Neighbors might be wary or unhelpful, and even extended family might discourage keeping the child at home. It was a lonely, uphill battle fought in living rooms and kitchens across the country. But these parents weren't just resilient, they were pioneers. As more and more families made the courageous decision to raise their children at home, they began to find each other. Maybe it was a chance encounter at a doctor's office, a mention in a newspaper, or hearing about another family through word of mouth. These connections were vital. They provided emotional support, shared practical tips, like where to find a pediatrician who wouldn't just tell you to institutionalize your child, and crucially, they discovered they weren't alone in their dissatisfaction with the status quo. They saw the potential in their children and realized that the limitations weren't inherent to the children themselves, but were imposed by a society unwilling to provide the necessary support and opportunities. These informal networks began to coalesce into organized parent groups. Often starting as small gatherings in someone's living room, they grew into local chapters and eventually, national organizations. Parents started writing letters, making phone calls, visiting legislators, and demanding change. They demanded better medical care, educational opportunities tailored to their children's needs, and the right for their children to be seen as valuable members of the community, not just burdens or objects of pity. They used their personal stories, their love for their children, and their sheer determination to challenge decades of ingrained prejudice and institutional inertia. It was like a quiet revolution, powered by nothing more than fierce parental love and the radical idea that their kids deserved better. Imagine showing up to a stuffy government meeting, armed not with degrees or data, but with photos of your child and stories of their daily triumphs and struggles. That took guts. A quirky, perhaps inspiring, tidbit from this era is the role that simple, home-based interventions played before professional services existed. Parents would invent their own teaching methods, create makeshift therapy equipment, and share ideas with each other. They became amateur experts in early childhood development, speech therapy, and special education, simply because they had to. They were driven by necessity and love, figuring out what worked through trial and error, proving that their children were capable of learning when given the chance. These weren't trained professionals. They were just moms and dads doing whatever it took, like trying to teach your kid to read using only cereal boxes and sheer willpower. The parent advocacy movement became a powerful force for change in the latter half of the 20th century. They lobbied for legislation that would mandate public education for children with disabilities, leading to landmark laws like the Education for All Handicapped Children Act in the United States in 1975, now IDEA. They exposed the horrific conditions in some of the worst institutions, bringing public attention to the neglect and abuse happening behind those walls, which fueled the movement towards deinstitutionalization. They pushed for medical research and better healthcare access. They challenged discriminatory attitudes and worked to change public perception. They were the catalysts that ignited the disability rights movement, proving that those most affected by injustice are often the most effective advocates for change. This era marks a fundamental shift. Before, the narrative was often driven by professionals and institutions, viewing intellectual disability through a lens of pathology and segregation. Now, parents were seizing control of the narrative, emphasizing their children's humanity, potential, and right to live full lives within their families and communities. It was a shift from a deficit model to a more humanistic one, driven by love and a fierce belief in their children's worth. Historians still argue whether the parent advocacy movement was the primary driver of the massive policy shifts that occurred in the late 20th century, like deinstitutionalization and special education mandates, or if it was one crucial factor among others, such as economic considerations. Institutions were expensive, and changing societal attitudes influenced by broader civil rights movements. But regardless of the exact weighting, there is no doubt that the tireless efforts of these early parent pioneers were absolutely essential in challenging the status quo and opening doors that had been firmly shut for centuries. Their fight wasn't just for their own children, it was for every child with a disability who would come after. They laid the groundwork for the rights and opportunities that exist today. They proved that individuals with Down syndrome and other intellectual disabilities were not problems to be hidden away, but people with potential, capable of learning, contributing, and enriching the lives of those around them, provided they were given the chance. Their legacy is the foundation of the inclusion movement and the ongoing fight for full rights and self-determination for people with disabilities. Their courage cracked the walls of the institutions and began to let the light in. So, the parents had started the fight. They had looked behind the polished brochures and the professional advice and seen the reality of the institutions, and they said, "No more." Their love and frustration began to chip away at the foundation of the system that had hidden away their children for decades. And as more parents spoke out, and as their numbers grew into organized groups, the world outside the institution walls slowly began to pay attention. Imagine, for a moment, what it took for those parents. Not only were they challenging a deeply ingrained societal practice, but they were also going up against medical authorities, government officials, and a public that often preferred not to think about the feeble-minded tucked away in those distant facilities. But their persistence, their sheer refusal to be silenced, started to make cracks in the facade. And those cracks allowed a little bit of light, and eventually, investigative journalists, lawyers, and advocates started to look closer at what was happening inside those walls. What they found was often horrifying. Reports began to surface, detailing the overcrowding, the lack of sanitation, the inadequate medical care, the physical restraints, and the profound lack of human dignity afforded to the residents. Conditions that were not exceptions, but the norm in many of the largest, most underfunded institutions. This was no longer just parental complaint. It was undeniable evidence of systemic neglect and abuse. It was like pulling back a curtain and revealing a scene straight out of a nightmare, hidden away from the polite society that had allowed it to happen. Trying to explain that these places were supposed to be care facilities must have felt like a cruel joke to the parents, who saw the reality. This growing awareness, fueled by the parent movement and exposés, led to a fundamental shift in thinking about how society should support individuals with intellectual disabilities. The consensus began to build: the large, isolated institution was not the answer. It was inhumane, ineffective, and expensive. A new idea started to gain traction, one that had been whispered about by a few progressive thinkers for decades, but now had the momentum of public outcry behind it: deinstitutionalization. This is your mainstream historical fact, beginning in the latter half of the 20th century, largely spurred by parent advocacy, legal challenges, and public exposés. The United States and many other Western countries began a widespread movement to close large state-run institutions for individuals with intellectual disabilities and move residents into smaller, community-based living arrangements. It was a monumental undertaking, aiming to reverse decades of segregation and confinement. The goal was to transition people from living in facilities that might house thousands to living in homes with just a few roommates, integrated into regular neighborhoods. The motivations for this massive shift were complex. There was a growing moral and ethical imperative, the recognition that warehousing people was wrong and violated basic human rights. There was also the powerful advocacy of parents and emerging disability rights groups who demanded better lives for their loved ones. Changing professional attitudes played a role, as new approaches to education and support suggested that individuals with intellectual disabilities could learn and participate in community life with appropriate support, challenging the old eugenic notions of fixed, low potential. And frankly, there were economic arguments too. Maintaining sprawling, decrepit institutions was incredibly costly, and community-based services, while requiring investment, could sometimes be framed as a more efficient use of resources in the long run. It was a perfect storm of humanitarian concern, parent power, evolving professional understanding, and fiscal realities that finally cracked the institutional system wide open. One particularly impactful moment that galvanized public support for deinstitutionalization was the series of investigative reports by journalist Geraldo Rivera in the early 1970s, particularly his exposé of the Willowbrook State School in Staten Island, New York. This is your quirky or fringe tidbit, not because it was fringe in impact, it was huge, but because it was a journalist, not a scientist or politician, wielding the power of television to bring the horrors of institutional life into people's living rooms. Rivera snuck cameras into Willowbrook and showed shocking images of neglect, overcrowding, and inhumane conditions. The footage was graphic and undeniable, showing residents often naked, covered in feces, and lacking basic care or stimulation. The public reaction was outrage, and the Willowbrook exposé became a national scandal, a powerful symbol of everything that was wrong with the institutional system, and a major catalyst for reform and closure. It was like watching a horror movie, but knowing it was real, and happening right now, funded by your taxes. The process of deinstitutionalization wasn't easy, however. It involved not just closing buildings but fundamentally restructuring an entire system of care and support. Thousands of individuals who had spent their entire lives within institutional walls, with minimal exposure to the outside world, had to be prepared for community living. Many lacked basic life skills, not because they couldn't learn them, but because they had never been taught. They needed support with everything from managing money and using public transport to cooking a meal and navigating social interactions in a neighborhood. New community residences, group homes, and support services had to be created from scratch, and finding funding and overcoming not-in-my-backyard resistance from communities who didn't want group homes in Irby were constant challenges. And while the intent of deinstitutionalization was overwhelmingly positive, to provide more humane, individualized care in integrated settings, the implementation sometimes fell short. Some individuals were moved from large state institutions into smaller, privately run facilities that were not much better, or into poorly supported living situations that left them vulnerable. Historians still argue whether the initial phase of deinstitutionalization, while ending the era of massive institutions, always resulted in genuinely higher quality of life and better outcomes for all individuals, or if some were simply moved from one inadequate setting to another before community support systems fully matured. The transition was complex, messy, and uneven, with both triumphs and significant challenges. Despite the difficulties, the movement marked a profound shift. It recognized the inherent dignity and potential of individuals with intellectual disabilities, including those with Down syndrome, and affirmed their right to live in the community, close to family, and participate in society. It wasn't just about closing institutions. It was about opening doors to homes, to schools, to jobs, and to relationships. The long, dark era of hiding people away behind institutional walls was beginning to end, replaced by the slow, sometimes difficult, but ultimately more hopeful work of building inclusive communities where everyone had a place. The fight wasn't over, but the battleground had shifted from the distant asylum grounds to the heart of the neighborhood. So, the institutions were starting to empty. The walls were coming down, literally and figuratively, thanks in large part to the relentless push from parents who refused to accept that their children should be locked away. Individuals who had spent years, sometimes their whole lives, hidden from the world were beginning to move back into communities. But once someone was living in a house instead of a dormitory, the next question immediately arose: what about their education? For centuries, and particularly during the era of widespread institutionalization, the idea of providing meaningful education to individuals with significant intellectual disabilities, including those with Down syndrome, was simply not a priority, and often not even considered possible. The prevailing belief was that their capacity for learning was so limited that formal schooling was pointless. In institutions, any training was usually basic vocational tasks or self-care, not academic learning. Outside institutions, if a child with Down syndrome lived at home, they were typically excluded from public schools. Parents might try to teach them basic things at home, or perhaps if they were lucky, find a small, private school that specialized in working with children who had developmental differences. But these were rare and expensive. Imagine a world where your local school district could just say, "Nope, your kid doesn't qualify," based purely on a perceived disability. That was the reality for generations. But as parents began to fight for their children's right to live in the community, they also fought for their right to learn. They saw their children making progress at home, learning skills, showing curiosity, and forming relationships. They knew the old narrative of hopelessness was wrong. They demanded that the public education system, funded by their taxes, serve all children, including those with disabilities. This grassroots pressure, combined with growing legal challenges arguing that excluding children based on disability was discriminatory, began to force a change in policy. This leads us to a pivotal mainstream historical fact. In many Western countries, particularly the United States, the latter half of the 20th century saw the passage of landmark legislation mandating public education for children with disabilities. In the U.S., the most significant was the Education for All Handicapped Children Act of 1975, later renamed the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or IDEA. This law guaranteed a free appropriate public education, FAPE, in the least restrictive environment, LRE, for all children with disabilities. What did that mean in plain English? It meant that schools could no longer simply turn away a child because they had Down syndrome or another disability. They had to provide an education tailored to that child's needs, and they had to do it in a setting that was as close as possible to where their non-disabled peers were being educated. It was a legal earthquake that fundamentally changed the landscape of education for millions of children. Imagine the relief and hope for a parent who had been told for years that their child was uneducable, suddenly having the law on their side, demanding that the school open its doors. Getting those doors open, however, was just the first step, and often a challenging one. The concept of least restrictive environment immediately brought up the question of inclusion. Should students with Down syndrome be educated entirely separately in special schools or classrooms? Should they be mainstreamed, for some subjects or activities, joining their non-disabled peers for things like art, music, or recess? Or should they be fully included in regular classrooms with support? This sparked intense debate among educators, parents, and advocates, and different models of inclusion were tried, sometimes successfully, sometimes with significant bumps in the road. Teachers in regular classrooms often had no training in working with students with diverse learning needs and felt unprepared. Schools lacked resources for necessary support staff or specialized materials. And unfortunately, students with disabilities often face social barriers, sometimes experiencing bullying or exclusion from their peers. It wasn't a smooth transition from segregation to seamless inclusion. It was a messy, ongoing process of trial and error, driven by the legal mandate but often hampered by practical challenges and lingering societal attitudes. Trying to integrate someone who's only ever known institutional life into a bustling kindergarten classroom? Yeah, that's going to take some work, and maybe a few extra crayons. Despite the challenges, the shift towards educational inclusion, in whatever form it took, had a profound impact. For the first time on a large scale, children with Down syndrome were given the opportunity to learn alongside their peers, to develop social skills in natural environments, and to access curriculum, adapted as needed, that had previously been off-limits. Educators and researchers began to develop new teaching strategies specifically designed for diverse learners, focusing on individual strengths and needs rather than perceived deficits. The very act of being present in a school setting normalized disability for a generation of non-disabled students, fostering greater understanding and acceptance, though this too was, and remains, an ongoing process. A quirky, perhaps inspiring, tidbit from the early days of special education and inclusion was the development of highly individualized, often creative, teaching materials and methods. Before standardized special education curricula existed, dedicated teachers and parents would invent their own ways to teach reading, math, and life skills, often using everyday objects, visual aids, and hands-on activities. They were pioneers in differentiated instruction, figuring out how to break down complex tasks into smaller steps and provide the specific support each student needed to succeed. It was like a massive, decentralized R&D department for learning, fueled by necessity and a belief that these kids could learn if you just found the right key to unlock their potential. Imagine a teacher using a deck of cards and a pile of buttons to teach basic arithmetic because that's what clicked for a particular student. Genius born of necessity. The impact of this educational shift on individuals with Down syndrome has been immeasurable. Access to education has led to increased literacy, numeracy, and life skills. It has opened doors to vocational training and, for some, competitive employment. Crucially, it has allowed for greater social integration and the development of friendships and relationships outside the family. It has raised expectations for what individuals with Down syndrome can achieve, shifting the narrative from one of lifelong dependence to one of greater independence and participation in community life. However, the journey towards true educational inclusion is far from over. Debates continue about the best educational settings, the level of support needed, and how to ensure that inclusion is meaningful and beneficial for all students, both disabled and non-disabled. Historians still argue whether the primary driver of the inclusion movement was a genuine belief in the educational potential and rights of individuals with disabilities, or if it was significantly influenced by the economic pressures of closing expensive institutions and a desire to shift responsibility for care and education onto the public school system. Was it primarily a humanitarian triumph, a cost-saving measure, or a complex mix of both? Regardless of the precise motivations, the shift towards education marked a crucial step forward. It moved individuals with Down syndrome out of the shadows of institutionalization and into the classrooms, placing them back into the heart of community life during their formative years. It wasn't perfect, and challenges remained, but the legal right to learn, fought for and won by parents and advocates, fundamentally changed the trajectory of countless lives, replacing the old, bleak prognosis with the possibility of learning, growth, and inclusion. The classroom became the new frontier in the ongoing fight for recognition and rights. So, the school doors were finally beginning to creak open, offering possibilities for learning and social connection that had been denied for generations. But even with the chance to learn, there was another huge barrier that profoundly impacted the lives and potential of individuals with Down syndrome: health. For most of history, and certainly well into the mid-20th century, life expectancy for someone with Down syndrome was tragically short. We're talking about survival often measured in years, maybe stretching into the teens or early 20s if they were lucky and had exceptional care. Common health issues associated with the condition, like congenital heart defects, respiratory infections, and gastrointestinal problems, frequently went untreated or were poorly managed, leading to early death. It was a stark reality. Even if you escaped the institution, your body itself presented immense, often insurmountable, challenges. Imagine finally getting the chance to go to school, only to be constantly battling serious medical issues with limited access to effective treatment. But just as parents and advocates were fighting for educational rights and community living, another quiet revolution was happening, this one in the world of medicine. The latter half of the 20th century saw incredible advancements in medical knowledge and technology. New diagnostic tools were developed, surgical techniques became more sophisticated, and our understanding of the human body deepened exponentially. And crucially, as individuals with Down syndrome began living outside institutions and accessing mainstream healthcare, often thanks to those tireless parent advocates demanding it, their specific health needs started to receive more attention from the broader medical community. This brings us to a pivotal mainstream historical fact. Since the mid-20th century, there has been a dramatic increase in the life expectancy of individuals with Down syndrome, largely due to significant advancements in medical diagnosis and treatment of associated health conditions. Before the 1950s, the average lifespan was often less than 20 years. Today, thanks to modern medicine, it's around 60 years, and many individuals live well into their 60s and 70s. That's a profound transformation, changing the trajectory of a life from a brief, often medically fragile existence to one that can encompass decades of adulthood, work, relationships, and participation in the community. It's hard to overstate how huge this shift is. It wasn't a single miracle cure, but a combination of many different pieces falling into place. Let's talk about some of those pieces. Congenital heart defects are common in individuals with Down syndrome. In the past, these often went undiagnosed or were considered inoperable, leading to heart failure early in life. Advances in cardiac surgery, particularly for infants and young children, have made it possible to repair many of these defects, allowing hearts that were struggling to function properly to become strong and healthy. Think about it. A surgery that might have been science fiction a century ago is now a routine procedure that can save a life and add decades to it. Similarly, respiratory issues, often exacerbated by structural differences in the airways and immune system challenges, were frequently fatal. Better understanding of these vulnerabilities, along with improved treatments for infections and conditions like sleep apnea, have drastically reduced mortality rates from respiratory illness. It's like going from just hoping you don't catch a cold that turns into pneumonia, to having a whole arsenal of tools to keep your lungs healthy. Beyond the major life-threatening conditions, medical progress has also vastly improved daily health and well-being by addressing other common comorbidities. Conditions like thyroid dysfunction, celiac disease, vision problems, like cataracts or strabismus, and hearing loss are more prevalent in people with Down syndrome. In the past, these might have been missed or attributed solely to the intellectual disability, their impact on development and daily life underestimated. This is where our quirky, perhaps counterintuitive, tidbit comes in. One of the quiet triumphs of modern medical care has been the recognition and routine screening for these secondary conditions, because treating them effectively can have a surprisingly significant impact on an individual's overall health, development, and quality of life. For example, treating a thyroid issue or correcting vision problems can dramatically improve cognitive function and independence, demonstrating that not all challenges were inherent to the core condition but were sometimes treatable medical issues layered on top. It's like finding out your car wasn't just slow because it was old, but because the tires were flat and the engine needed oil. Fix the simple things, and the whole machine runs better. Improved access to preventative care, including regular checkups, vaccinations, and specialized screenings recommended specifically for individuals with Down syndrome, has also played a huge role. This shift from reactive care, only treating problems when they became severe, to proactive, preventative care has meant catching potential issues early, before they become life-threatening or significantly impact development. It's the difference between waiting for a major illness to strike and having regular checkups and tests to keep everything running smoothly. However, despite these incredible strides, the story of medical care isn't without complexity. Historians still argue whether the dramatic increase in life expectancy for individuals with Down syndrome is primarily attributable to advancements in medical technology and surgical interventions, or if broader societal improvements like better nutrition, sanitation, overall living conditions, moving out of those often unhealthy institutions, and increased support and care within families and communities played an equally or even more significant role. It's a complex web of factors, and untangling which thread was most important is a challenge. Was it the doctors and surgeons, or was it the better food, cleaner air, and loving families? Probably a bit of everything, wouldn't you say? The fight for equitable access to healthcare also continues. while medical knowledge has advanced, ensuring that every individual with Down syndrome, regardless of their socioeconomic status or location, receives the high-quality, specialized care they need remains an ongoing challenge in many parts of the world. Navigating complex healthcare systems, finding doctors with specific expertise in Down syndrome, and affording necessary treatments and therapies are still significant hurdles for many families. Nevertheless, the medical progress of the past several decades has fundamentally changed what it means to live with Down syndrome. It has transformed a condition often seen as incompatible with a long life into one where individuals can anticipate decades of potential, participation, and contribution. It has allowed the focus to shift from mere survival to thriving, enabling individuals to benefit from the educational opportunities and community inclusion that parents and advocates fought so hard to achieve. The longer, healthier lives made possible by medical advancements have reshaped the narrative, opening up possibilities that were simply unimaginable for most of history. So, we've seen how medical science dramatically improved health outcomes, giving people with Down syndrome the chance for longer, healthier lives, and how that built upon the educational opportunities won through fierce parent advocacy, which in turn was a response to the horrors of institutionalization and the twisted logic of eugenics, all of which followed center. Of misunderstanding, fear, and a profound lack of knowledge stretching back to ancient times. It feels like we've covered a lot of ground, mostly centered on the historical trajectory in Europe and North America, where much of the surviving historical record and the major policy shifts we've discussed originated. But it's important to remember that human history isn't a single river flowing in one direction. It's a vast ocean with countless currents and tides. While the story of Dr. Down, eugenics, and Western institutions is a significant part of the picture, it's not the only picture. How were people with these differences perceived and treated in other parts of the world, across different cultures and continents, throughout these same long centuries? The simple, yet complex, mainstream historical fact is that approaches to intellectual disability, including conditions we would now recognize as Down syndrome, varied significantly across different global cultures and historical periods, influenced by unique religious beliefs, social structures, economic realities, and philosophical traditions that were often completely independent of Western developments. There wasn't a single, universal human experience of intellectual difference throughout history. It was shaped by the specific context of the society an individual was born into. Think about it. The ideas circulating in ancient China about harmony and social order were vastly different from those in medieval Europe dominated by feudalism and Christianity, or those in indigenous communities centered on kinship and connection to nature. These different worldviews inevitably filtered how difference was perceived and responded to. In some non-Western societies, particularly those with strong extended family structures or community-focused traditions, individuals with intellectual differences might have been integrated into daily life more naturally than was often the case in the increasingly industrialized and individualistic West. While there was still likely a lack of specific understanding of the condition itself, the emphasis might have been more on finding a role within the family or village structure, however limited, rather than immediate segregation or institutionalization. Survival would still have been challenging, especially in harsh environments, but the approach to care and inclusion could differ. In cultures where ancestor reverence or spiritual beliefs were central, a person who behaved differently might, in some instances, be seen through a spiritual lens, perhaps as possessing a unique connection to the spirit world, or as a soul with a different path. This isn't to say it was always easy or accepting, but the framework for understanding difference could be less focused purely on productivity or intellectual capacity and more on spiritual or social roles within the collective. Consider, for example, the varying perspectives influenced by major global religions outside of Christianity and Islam, which we touched on earlier. In Hindu traditions, concepts of karma and reincarnation might influence how congenital differences were understood, potentially seen as related to past lives, leading to a complex mix of acceptance, pity, or fatalism. Buddhist philosophy, with its emphasis on compassion and the impermanence of self, could foster attitudes of acceptance towards suffering and difference, though practical care and support systems would still depend heavily on social structures and economic resources. traditional African belief systems, often centered on community, family, and spiritual forces, would interpret difference through their own unique cosmological lenses, sometimes leading to fear, sometimes to integration, depending on the specific cultural group and the perceived nature of the difference. Trying to map a single Western historical narrative onto this vast tapestry of global belief systems is impossible. Each thread is distinct. Imagine trying to explain the concept of court jesters to someone whose society has no kings, or discussing eugenics with a community whose primary concern is maintaining spiritual harmony with the land. The concepts just wouldn't translate directly. A quirky, perhaps eye-opening, tidbit revealing a different cultural approach comes from some historical accounts or anthropological studies of certain indigenous communities. In some cases, individuals with significant differences were not necessarily seen as burdens or problems to be solved, but simply as members of the community who required different kinds of support and care. Their value wasn't measured by their ability to hunt or farm, but by their inherent place within the kinship network and the community's collective responsibility for all its members. While this is not a universal truth across all indigenous cultures or time periods, and challenges certainly existed, it contrasts sharply with the Western historical tendency towards segregation and measuring human worth primarily by intellectual or economic contribution. It suggests that some societies, perhaps less driven by industrial productivity or rigid social hierarchies, found ways to integrate difference more organically into the fabric of daily life. It's like the difference between a modern factory assembly line, where every part must fit perfectly, and a traditional craft workshop, where unique variations might be seen as part of the handmade charm. However, it's also important to acknowledge that the dark chapters of Western history, particularly colonialism and the spread of eugenics, did impact other parts of the world. Western medical models and institutional approaches were often exported, sometimes replacing or undermining traditional forms of community support. Eugenics ideas, tragically, gained traction in some non-Western countries as well, influenced by their adoption in powerful Western nations. So, while historical paths were different, they weren't always isolated, and the influence wasn't always positive. Understanding the global variations in how intellectual disability was perceived throughout history is challenging because the historical records outside of Europe and North America are often less focused on medical conditions or social welfare systems in the way Western records are. Much of what we know comes from anthropological studies, interpretations of cultural practices, and scattered historical accounts, which can be difficult to piece together into a comprehensive narrative. Historians still argue whether the relative lack of historical documentation about intellectual disability in many non-Western societies indicates lower survival rates, different cultural interpretations that didn't categorize it in ways recognizable to Western scholars, or simply different priorities in record-keeping and historical narrative. Was it less common, seen differently, or just not written down in ways we can easily access and understand? Ultimately, exploring these global views reminds us that the specific historical trajectory we've traced, from ancient shadows to institutional walls and then towards inclusion, is just one version of a broader human story about how societies grapple with difference. It highlights that segregation and marginalization are not inevitable responses to intellectual disability, but rather products of specific historical, social, and cultural forces. The diverse historical paths taken around the world underscore the fact that while the biological reality of Down syndrome exists universally, the experience of living with it has been profoundly shaped by the very beliefs, fears, and structures of the societies individuals were born into. This global perspective sets the stage for the modern era, where advocacy for rights and self-determination is becoming a more unified, global movement, aiming to ensure a more positive and inclusive future for individuals with Down syndrome, no matter where they live. So, we've seen the incredibly varied ways that different cultures and historical periods perceived and treated individuals with intellectual differences, shaped by everything from ancient fears and pragmatic survival needs to religious doctrines, scientific classifications, and the dark ideologies of eugenics. We've traced a path, particularly in the West, from hidden shadows to institutional walls, and then, thanks to fierce parent advocacy and medical progress, towards education and longer, healthier lives within communities. But even with these significant steps forward, the chance to go to school, access to better healthcare, the possibility of living at home, there was still a crucial element missing for many individuals with Down syndrome and other disabilities: their own voice, their own power to make choices about their lives. For centuries, decisions about people with intellectual disabilities were made for them, by families, by institutions, by doctors, by the state. They were seen as passive recipients of care, objects of pity or charity, or problems to be managed. Even the most well-meaning parent advocates, who fought so hard to get their children out of institutions and into schools, were still largely speaking on behalf of their children. While absolutely necessary and groundbreaking at the time, this dynamic still positioned the person with the disability as someone whose needs and future were determined by others. But as the 20th century wore on, paralleling other civil rights movements demanding equality and autonomy for marginalized groups, a new force began to emerge: the disability rights movement, with a growing emphasis on self-advocacy and self-determination. This is your mainstream historical fact. The latter half of the 20th century saw the rise of a powerful, international disability rights movement, which increasingly championed the principles of independent living, full inclusion, and critically, self-advocacy, the idea that individuals with disabilities have the right and capacity to speak for themselves, make their own choices, and direct their own lives. This movement wasn't just about getting people out of institutions or into schools. It was about fundamentally changing societal attitudes and structures so that people with disabilities were recognized as full citizens with inherent rights, dignity, and the ability to make decisions, just like everyone else. It was about moving from a model of caretaking to a model of civil rights. Imagine the shift from someone else deciding where you live, what you eat, and how you spend your day, to you getting to decide those things yourself. Revolutionary, right? For individuals with Down syndrome, who had historically been particularly marginalized and underestimated in terms of their cognitive abilities and capacity for complex thought or decision-making, the concept of self-advocacy was especially transformative. It challenged centuries of low expectations and the paternalistic assumption that they were incapable of understanding their own needs or making meaningful choices. Early self-advocates, often with the support of allies, began to form groups where they could learn about their rights, develop communication skills, and practice speaking up for themselves. They started small, maybe deciding what activities they wanted to do in a group home, or what job they wanted to try. But these small steps built confidence and capability. A quirky, and deeply inspiring, tidbit from the early days of the self-advocacy movement is the coining of the term people-first language. This movement, largely driven by self-advocates themselves, insisted on language that puts the person before the disability, saying, "person with a disability," instead of "disabled person," or "people with Down syndrome," instead of "Down syndrome people." This wasn't just semantics. It was a deliberate act of reclaiming identity and emphasizing humanity. They were saying, loud and clear, "We are people first. Our disability is just one part of who we are, not the defining characteristic." It was a simple linguistic shift with profound philosophical implications, a quiet rebellion against being defined solely by a medical label. Imagine telling the world, "Stop calling me a case, I'm a person." The fight for self-determination involved challenging deeply ingrained societal attitudes and systemic barriers. It meant pushing for supported decision-making models instead of automatic guardianship, advocating for accessible information and communication methods, and demanding a seat at the table in policy discussions that affected their lives. It meant fighting for the right to choose where to live, who to live with, what job to pursue, and even whether or not to marry and have children, rights that had been denied or severely restricted under the old eugenic and institutional models. It was a battle on multiple fronts: legal, social, and personal. Individuals with Down syndrome, who had once been invisible or only seen as objects of pity, began to gain visibility as speakers, activists, and leaders. They shared their experiences of discrimination, challenged stereotypes, and demonstrated their capabilities and desires. They became living proof that the low expectations of the past were wrong. They testified before legislatures, spoke at conferences, and educated the public, often with courage and determination that defied the very idea that they were incapable or intellectually limited. It's like going from being told you can't even tie your own shoes to standing on a stage and eloquently arguing for your civil rights. Talk about exceeding expectations. However, the path to full self-determination is still an ongoing journey, filled with complexities and challenges. While the principles of self-advocacy are widely accepted in theory within the disability community, and by many policymakers, putting them into practice consistently across society is difficult. Ensuring that individuals with varying levels of intellectual support needs genuinely have the resources, information, and support necessary to make informed choices is a complex task. Balancing autonomy with the need for support and protection from exploitation requires careful consideration and individualized approaches. And unfortunately, paternalistic attitudes and systemic barriers, while challenged, have not disappeared entirely. Historians still argue whether the self-advocacy movement arose primarily as a natural evolution and maturation of the earlier parent advocacy efforts, or if it represented a distinct, sometimes even conflicting, movement that had to push against some of the established disability organizations to truly center the voices of individuals with disabilities themselves. Was it a seamless handover, or a new generation taking the reins with a different vision? Despite the challenges, the rise of self-advocacy has fundamentally changed the narrative for individuals with Down syndrome. It has shifted the focus from what others think they can or should do to what they themselves want and are capable of with appropriate support. It has empowered individuals to pursue their goals, live more independent lives, and participate more fully in their communities. It has recognized their inherent worth and their right to direct their own destinies. The fight for rights and recognition, which began with parents demanding basic care and education, has evolved into a movement where individuals with Down syndrome are increasingly leading the way, demanding nothing less than full inclusion and the right to live lives of their own choosing. The journey is far from over, but the voices that were once silenced or spoken for are now being heard, clear and strong, demanding their rightful place in the world. So, the voices of individuals with Down syndrome and their allies grew louder, demanding rights, inclusion, and the power to make their own decisions. This relentless advocacy, building on the foundation laid by parents and fueled by medical progress and educational access, has brought us to where we are today. Imagine stepping out of that long, historical journey we've been on and landing squarely in the early 21st century. What does life look like now for someone with Down syndrome, compared to the ancient shadows, the institutional walls, or the limited expectations of even a few decades ago? The most significant change, the one that encompasses so much of the progress we've discussed, is the shift towards full inclusion and participation in community life as the norm, rather than the exception. This is your mainstream historical fact. In many parts of the world, particularly where disability rights movements have been strong and supportive policies enacted, the expectation and reality for individuals with Down syndrome is increasingly one of living at home or in community-based settings, attending local schools, participating in social activities, and pursuing vocational or employment goals. A complete reversal of the segregation and institutionalization that defined much of the 20th century. You see people with Down syndrome working in restaurants, volunteering at libraries, attending college classes, participating in sports, creating art, and living rich, connected lives within the fabric of their communities. It's a world away from being hidden in an asylum, isn't it? This transformation didn't happen magically. It's the direct result of those decades of struggle, the legal battles for educational rights, remember IDEA, the fight for deinstitutionalization. Think of Geraldo Rivera at Willowbrook, chilling stuff, the medical breakthroughs that extended life and improved health, those heart surgeries, and the tireless efforts of self-advocates demanding recognition and respect. Today, early intervention services are widely available in many places, providing crucial support to infants and young children to help them reach their developmental milestones. Inclusive education, while still facing challenges, is the standard in many school districts, allowing students with Down syndrome to learn alongside their peers and develop social skills in natural environments. Vocational training programs and supported employment services are helping individuals find meaningful work and contribute to the economy. It's a world where potential is nurtured, not dismissed out of hand. Ongoing research continues to deepen our understanding of Down syndrome. Scientists are studying the genetics of trisomy 21 in incredible detail, looking beyond just the presence of the extra chromosome to understand how specific genes on that chromosome contribute to the various characteristics of the syndrome. This research holds the promise of developing targeted therapies to address specific health issues or cognitive challenges in the future. Cognitive research is exploring new ways to support learning and memory, challenging old assumptions about fixed intellectual limits. We're not just observing and classifying anymore. We're actively seeking ways to support development and enhance capabilities. Despite the immense progress, significant challenges remain. Lingering prejudice and discrimination haven't vanished entirely. Individuals with Down syndrome and their families still face attitudinal barriers, low expectations from some segments of society, and difficulties accessing necessary support services in many areas. Employment rates, while improving, are still lower than for the general population, and finding truly meaningful and well-compensated work can be difficult. The transition to adulthood, including navigating independent living options, relationships, and continued learning, presents its own set of complexities. And as the lifespan for individuals with Down syndrome has dramatically increased, we are also seeing the emergence of new health challenges associated with aging, such as increased risk of Alzheimer's disease, which require dedicated research and specialized care. The journey didn't end when the institutions closed, it just moved to a different, perhaps more nuanced phase. A quirky, and incredibly hopeful, tidbit about the modern era is the role of technology in enhancing independence and communication for individuals with Down syndrome. From communication apps on tablets that help non-speaking or minimally speaking individuals express themselves, to smart home devices that aid with daily routines and safety, to online communities that connect people with Down syndrome and their families across the globe, technology is opening up possibilities for learning, connection, and autonomy that were unimaginable even 20 years ago. Imagine using a simple app to order your own groceries or video calling a friend who lives across the country. Technology is helping break down barriers and build bridges. The future outlook is one of cautious optimism and continued advocacy. The goal is not just inclusion, but true belonging and full citizenship. This means ensuring equal opportunities in education, employment, healthcare, and community life. It means supporting individuals to make their own choices and live self-directed lives, with the right supports in place. It means continuing to challenge stereotypes and promote positive, accurate representations of people with Down syndrome in media and popular culture. It means ongoing research to improve health and cognitive outcomes, while always remembering that the focus is on supporting individuals, not trying to cure who they are. However, this ongoing work raises complex questions. Historians still argue whether the current emphasis on independence and inclusion, while clearly preferable to institutionalization, adequately addresses the diverse support needs of all individuals with Down syndrome across their lifespan, or if there's a risk of underservicing those with more significant support requirements in the drive towards mainstream integration. Finding the right balance between promoting independence and ensuring adequate, individualized support is a constant discussion and a key challenge for the future. Ultimately, the story of how people with Down syndrome have been treated throughout history is a mirror reflecting humanity's changing understanding of difference, disability, and dignity. It's a journey from invisibility and fear to recognition and rights, from segregation and low expectations to inclusion and burgeoning self-determination. It shows us the power of prejudice and ignorance, but also the incredible strength of love, advocacy, and the human spirit's capacity to learn, adapt, and fight for a better world. We've come a long way from those ancient shadows, but the journey towards a society where every person, regardless of their genetic makeup, is truly valued, included, and empowered to live a life of their own choosing is still very much in progress. And so, our long journey through history comes to a close for tonight. We've traveled from flickering firelight in ancient caves, through bustling classical forums, across medieval landscapes of faith and fear, into the courts of the Renaissance and the laboratories of the Enlightenment. We saw the birth of a medical description, the dark shadow of eugenics, the isolating walls of institutions, and the bright, unwavering light of parents' love and self-advocates' determination that finally began to crack those walls and open doors. We've seen how medicine and education transform possibilities, and how the fight for rights continues to shape the present and the future. It's a heavy history, isn't it? One filled with hardship and injustice, but also with incredible resilience, courage, and progress. As you drift off tonight, perhaps let the weight of this long story settle gently. Remember the people who lived through these eras, the challenges they faced, and the quiet dignity they held on to. Think about how far we've come, and how much further there is still to go. Let the images fade, the cold stone of the asylum, the hopeful face in a classroom, the quiet determination of an advocate speaking their truth. Breathe softly now, the journey is over for tonight. Rest, and dream of a future where every person is seen, valued, and belongs.